I've been in the meat space for about 25 years, the space between buying live animals from the farm all the way through to producing food in restaurants and in supermarkets. And that connection is so interesting to me because there's also such a huge disconnect, right? There are so many people out there that think milk generally just comes from a bottle, or meat, you go get it from the butcher, but there's no real connection to the full story of what farms and farmers out there are doing. And I think this is a really good medium to help try to break down those educational barriers. And I've been incredibly lucky in my career to meet some amazing people. One of the reasons we do 6 Inches of Soul is to try to bring the voices of these experts together to try to help people understand the connection between their everyday lives through the food they're eating and where that food comes from and the impact and the signals that sends to the farming world.
I mean, it is such a privilege to get an insight into such a diversity of different people's lives, let alone their businesses and their farms and their approaches, but also their ways of thinking. And often I find the conversations that you have when the microphone isn't on are just as interesting as those that are. And I often think, wish we could broadcast those to the world as well. But I think often, and there are reflections of podcasting actually in this as well. I think the big one is keep going, that actually there's a huge amount of resilience. There is a huge amount of that out there within the farming community and within the very exciting regen ag space. So sort of keep going, keep innovating, which again is another reflection within the podcast space. Things change. Things stay the same, but they also change as well. And those innovators out there, I also find a great privilege to actually get an insight into those innovations. And farmers who share tend to be, in my view, the farmers who are really going places and are really innovating their own businesses, but also helping others to innovate as well. And I think the third one is farmers who stay curious. Stay curious to those around them. And I think that's, again, something that we can all learn, whether we're farming or not, is actually stay curious to the world. Get out there, see what's going on and really bring those lessons home.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, especially when you get into those rural communities. People are always looking over the hedge to see what's going on. Equally, that can be challenging if you're trying to do something different.
Yeah, I think that I would echo a lot of what Ben said, but also the willingness, and it is part connected to what he said, but the willingness of people to share. And I think it's because they're motivated, by whatever threats they understand exist to farming, to ranching. They are motivated to help people overcome those things that become threats to their families, to the businesses, to the landscapes. It's valuable to keep families like this continuing to operate these landscapes. I think everybody understands that's the goal, and so whatever their motivation is, they're interested in helping their expertise.
Yeah, and the more that the stories get out there, the more people start to engage with where food comes from and how farming works. It's a really powerful way to empower the rural community to get more connected to where the food is being eaten. And Abby, I just finished re-listening to Cereals, your amazing series, and the way that you tell stories is insane, so engaging and wonderful. And honestly, you've changed my life in the way that I buy bread off the back of listening to that and just understanding how little I knew about something which I eat every day, which I was out there in the meat world saying I fully understand where meat comes from and what the breeds are and what they've eaten, and I really know my food. And I listened to your series and I realized that I have a sandwich every day for lunch, right? And I knew nothing about bread. Nothing. Anyway, tell us about the things that what have been your key takeaways that you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, I felt exactly the same when I first realized how the whole world of grains, it was just such, we're all engaging with it so much. It's almost like it becomes hidden or invisible. I was sourcing my tomatoes well, but I had no idea about where my cereals were coming from and hadn't even thought about it. So that cereal series was one of the kind of key moments of learning for me. Well, one, it opened my eyes to the whole world of grains and the people who were thinking differently about it. So we both looked at, the commodity grain system, and how that works, and maybe how it's coming to the end of its reasonable lifetime, as in making flour that has zero nutritional value. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe it made sense as we were getting to that point, but now we've got to a point where actually, could we ask some different questions? Maybe we want to do it slightly differently. And so talking to the people who are doing it slightly differently and asking those questions. That was the UK focused community. But actually the other side to it, which is more like a podcasting or storytelling viewpoint on it, is that, so 6 years on, we just did this bit of research and going back and asking, because many people wrote into us similar to you, saying like, I'd never thought about this. I'm changing my life. I've changed career. I'm doing this now. And so that was amazing at the time, but we didn't really take it any further. So 6 years on, we went back and recontacted some of those people and recorded their stories. And we've just released a podcast called Cereal Revisited. It's just one episode, but it tells some of the stories of people whose lives have completely changed. One farmer who shifted his system, they were growing commodity grains, and now they have their own farm shop where they mill their own flour and bake their own bread and sell to their local community, something they hadn't ever conceived of, and also how that affected their mental health as well. So things like that. And then also there's a girl on there who was an engineer, and after listening to the episode about the miller is missing, she became a miller. And now she's a miller in Nottingham. So that's a pretty radical life change. And also, not many people at school are like, oh, maybe I'll become a miller. Because it's not one of those things that's in our heads as a career or vocation. My final reflection is that the other insight that came out from talking to both the original contributors to Cereal and people who had listened and shifted their ways was just how powerful it is to tell this interlinked, interconnected story about a system. We started with what even is bread, and then how do you breed and come up with these seeds? What are some of the restrictions there? And then what are the farmers doing? What are the millers doing? What are the bakers doing? And then also, what about people eating it? So you really saw the whole system in one.
Yeah, and also this idea of really understanding the truth about food and where it comes from, and what your perception is when you're buying and eating something is it often can be very different to the reality. I mean, here in the States, we have big feedlots, feed yards, where picture 30,000 head of cattle in one gigantic car park. And some of those are organic. They're feeding them organic grains and corns. But when you're buying that organic beef in the supermarket, you're definitely not picturing in your mind this huge feed yard. And things like that, that's a big part of my mission, is to try to help people truly understand, to make sure that the values that they truly believe in match where their food is coming from and the signals they're sending out. Yeah, so anyway, I just think that there's still, and there will always be a disconnect, especially as we've gone from such a local system. I mean, I was at a grain mill here in Austin, Texas last week, and he had up on the wall all these little sacks from history. Each little town used to have its own grain mill, and they all had their own brand. And on the wall is just all of these multiple different brands. And now, of course, none of those mills exist. They've all been centralized, and the distance from the farmer to the person eating the bread is larger than it's ever been.
When I was living in Scotland, there was a farmer that lived adjacent to where I was living, and he dug a hole in the field, and I didn't know why he dug a hole in the field. I'm not convinced that he knew why he dug a hole in the field, but what I noticed was that every other farmer in the vicinity dug a hole in the field fairly shortly afterwards. And so it's this idea of looking over the hedge and the way in which actually that hedge has become a set of headphones and a microphone. And, you know, through the podcast, through other people's podcasts, farmers can now look over a hedge which is on the other side of the country and on the other side of the world, and really sort of learn from the best. And I think that, you know, that's one of the really important things. So, you know, some of the conversations that I most enjoy are those where I've got farmers, on talking to each other about the things that they're doing, the learnings that they've had, the way that they've gone from farming pretty intensively to, often through some sort of crisis or other, to then finding regenerative agriculture and becoming more resilient and happier, as a result, more economically sustainable. But one of the big things, I suppose, over the course of the last few years is the idea that soil is a great big tent, and it's something that unites so many different people. And a decade or so back, maybe 15 years ago, I did a lot of work with the UK Conservative Party around climate change. And at the time on climate change, there were literally 5 Tory MPs who would stand up and say, yeah, we believe in climate change as a clear and present danger. And so we did a lot of work with those MPs trying to work out why and what the impediments were. And a lot of it was to do with the rhetoric around it and the way that the left seemed to own the issue. The Conservatives hadn't found their place in it. And so we would reframe the language and work with those MPs to try and reframe the language to frame it around values rather than just campaigns and farming was part of that. It was, things that mattered to Conservative MPs. So it was security, and water and flooding in the constituency, those sorts of things. And suddenly that meant that more and more Conservatives were able to find their way into that climate change tent, as it was at the time. And so, just sort of 5 years later, there were probably fewer than 5 Conservative MPs who would have stood up and said that climate change wasn't a clear and present danger. So that was a big thing. But in terms of farming, soil is there. And for me, one of my really big interests these days is national security and global security in the face of climate and nature breakdown. And soil is the way that we solve this. And it's Peter Bick, who produced Roots So Deep, the fantastic film, who sort of talks about soil being a big tent. And through that tent, there are lots of different flaps, lots of different doors. And if you have all the farmers and all the natural capital people and all the land agents sort of all going in basically through a door on one side of the tent, that's fine. But it doesn't mean that raises the agenda, raises the importance of food and farming up that political agenda, because in the UK, as you know, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, it's right down the bottom. It has one of the smallest budgets. It's where ministers start off before being moved elsewhere. And yet it ought to be one of the top ones, along there with Foreign Affairs and Home. And so it's finding other flaps into that tent. And for me, national security, and part of that is food security and ecological security, that's a really big flap. And so that's where a lot of our work at the moment is in helping people to find that national security flap. Because in getting people to come into that big tent in different directions, suddenly food and farming and soil becomes a much bigger issue. So I think that key takeaway, that soil is something that affects everybody, even if they don't know it. And we can find ways of making sure that people understand that better. And suddenly food and farming becomes the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, 100%.
In 6 inches of soil, our world comes alive. A podcast of passion where all souls thrive. Soil mates unite in a bold common chase, building our future through Earth's living grace.